Hello everybody, nice to be here. I've never been to Walton-On-Thames before. Any reason why they didn't build Walton-On-Thames station in Walton-On-Thames? Because I've walked about 1.5 miles through a private estate. I had dogs chasing me just to get here from the station. But anyway, it's the first time here, and I did a show at the Edinburgh Fringe. There I am. So I did a show at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2019 called The Chain of Trivia. So if anybody does know the Robert Elm Show or other BBC local, I'm going to list BBC local radio stations all across the country, that if there's a rock and roll related story, I get a call. So if there's something about David Bowie and BBC Radio Shropshire wants a comment, they give me a call. Very, very big in Basingstoke. I've been on BBC Radio North Hampshire, or whatever it is, many, many times. I'm a household name in Basingstoke. But and not in Edinburgh. It was a successful show. I call it my sold-out show in Edinburgh. That means that 3 of the 21 shows sold out. The other 18 were, what time can you get there? I'll start when you can. It was a bit tumbleweed, but it was a very enjoyable experience. And so what I did, because my little niche is extraordinary rock and roll trivia. So I had a number. I went from Elvis Presley to Queen in 10 steps. So Elvis Presley linked to someone by an amazing bit of trivia, then that person to someone else by another bit of trivia, all the way up to Queen. So in the poster there, you can probably see I'm doing my Freddie Mercury impression there. And the lettering is from Elvis Presley's debut album, Elvis Presley. And The Clash nicked it for London Calling. So this is the last bit of that. The whole thing took 55 minutes on a good day in Edinburgh, so I haven't got that amount of time tonight. So I will start, as this is about number 7 in the chain, with this handsome devil. This is Marvin Gaye, spelt G-A-Y. His name was originally spelt G-A-Y, and he changed it because he'd been in the Air Force, the American Air Force, and it meant what in 1957 it meant in the Air Force, what it means now, and he didn't think that was particularly good, so he added an E to the end. It also he thought was numerologically very good luck, and it also meant that he could distinguish himself from his father. He was Marvin Gaye Jr., his father was Marvin Gaye Sr. If everybody remembers the story of Marvin Gaye Sr. killed Marvin Gaye Jr. They had a very, very violent and volatile relationship because his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was a minister in a particularly unforgiving church. There was incredible discipline which extended to everybody in the family, apart from Marvin Gaye's father, who could do what he liked. But Marvin Gaye was brought up in incredibly strict circumstances. And so the rest of his career, if anybody knows his music, where he talked, he has very odd ideas about love and hate and sex and everything like that. He's a very complex guy, but a wonderful singer and a very, very good-looking guy. And the way I'll connect is through Levi Jeans. So I'll get you thinking about Levi Jeans for a second. But he was very successful in America and not really so much here, on Motown. Motown is a record label based in Detroit. It's short for Motortown. Detroit is where they make all the cars in America. But he was unlike all the other acts on Motown, like the Four Tops and the Temptations and Gladys Knight, people like that. He was not from Detroit. He was from Washington, D.C. And he ended up by accident in Detroit playing in a jazz trio. He was a triple threat. He was a fantastic singer, a really good piano player, and a drummer. All 3. And he played in a trio. And talk about being in the right place at the right time. His little trio was booked to play the Motown Christmas Party, 1960. And he turned up and they did sort of an hour of gentle songs just to be the background music. And the owner of Motown, Berry Gordy, thought he was fantastic, loved his voice, loved his piano playing. And for the first 2 years of Marvin Gaye's career, he was the new Nat King Cole. So Motown's idea for him was to be a cool, suave Marv piano player with a fabulous voice. Nat King Cole was still alive. He died in 1965, but he was coming towards the end of his career, and Berry Gordy, who owned Motown Records, he thought that there should be a new one, much younger, much nicer looking, and Marvin was it. And no one bought the records. No one at all bought the records. And so eventually he became a pop singer like everyone else. And he wasn't particularly successful until At the end of the 1960s, he had a song called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which I'm sure everybody knows. It was an album track. It was not released as a single. It was some people in America on a radio station started playing it, and it just picked up momentum. And eventually, it was released as a single. It was the biggest selling single that Motown ever had. It was #1 here. I was 8 years old, I can remember it. My sister was a few years older than me, and she was watching Top of the Pops, and it was on there. It's a fantastic record. And that's how we get to Levi's Jeans. So he died in 1984, and he never really sold that many records, until typically, after you die, everyone goes out and buys your records. So all his greatest albums, What's Going On, if people are familiar with that record, that was only in the charts here after he died. It's terrible, really. A year after he died, Levi's Jeans decided to have a new advertising campaign. For the first time, they hadn't advertised Levi 501 jeans before, not on the television, and they went big, so they got sort of big advertising agency and very good directors and great production values. And the idea was you had a very glossy story, quite funny story. If you remember, it was a guy in a laundrette, and he's called Nick Kamen, if you remember. He died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. And he takes his trousers off, his Levi jeans, and he puts them in the washing machine, and he takes his t-shirt off. He's a nice-looking guy, I've got to say that. And then I think they may have hinted that he took his boxer shorts off, which is a bit saucy for 1985. And the song that was playing, they were marrying these sort of very glossy images with old songs, reactivated old songs. And in that case, they used I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Or did they? So when you hear a song in advertising, there are two people that get paid. One is the owner of the song, the publisher of the song. They get some money. That's so you can use the song, not the performance. If you want to use the actual performance, that's extra. In fact, it's double. So this was a new campaign for Levi's. You think you'd have tons of money, but they didn't want to necessarily risk too much money. So they actually said, well, we'll take the song, but instead of paying the extra 50,000, we'll pay 2,000 and get some musicians and some singers to do it as close as possible. Does anyone remember those LPs you used to get in Woolworths for 49p, where there was always a girl in a macrame bikini on the front, and they were near hits. Elton John was on most of those actually, but they sounded a bit like the hit single, but they weren't the hit single. And so if you listen, it was not Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine, it was someone else. But Motown re-released the record, and it went not to #1, but it got to the top 10. Almost 20 years after it was recorded. And so that set off, if people are aware, can remember, a whole series of reactivated songs that were mainly in Levi's commercials. And then people thought, well, that's a good idea, we'll do it. So people remember Sam Cooke and do you remember the Hollies? He Ain't Heavy Is My Brother. Anyone remember where that was from? Miller Lite Beer. All Right Now by Free. Wrigley Spearmint Gum. You've forgotten all this. My Baby Just Scares Me by Nina Simone. Chanel No. 5. Classy, eh? And so there's this whole trend in the late 80s, early 90s to use these old songs. And so they'd used I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And another one that they used was by these Herberts. These are, you can probably see, it's on his t-shirt. These are the Bluebells, if you remember the Bluebells, jangly pop, they're from Glasgow, early 80s. Some really good songs, Kath, I'm Falling, and the biggest hit in 1984 got to #8, which is decent showing, Young at Heart. Very good song, but then they ran out of steam, and they packed it all in, and they all went off to be geography teachers or journalists or whatever they did. 10 years later, the Volkswagen Golf, pay them £100,000 to use their recording of their song. Now that in 1993 is pretty good money when you've been working as a teacher for 7 or 8 years. And so it gets re-released, as these singles do, goes to the top of the charts. And our friends at Bluebells think, well, there might be some money to be made here. There's a Greatest Hits comes out. They reunite for, lucrative personal appearances on Top of the Pops. And so it makes a lot of money all of a sudden. Now, if anybody remembers the song, and I'd say to you, which bit do you particularly remember? You might go, da la 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 da. Sorry about that. I'm not booked to sing. The opening bit, which is played on a fiddle, played on a violin. And so none of the Bluebells played the violin. They got a session guy in, whose name was Bobby Valentino. Not his real name. But if you look at him on top of the box, he's the guy that looks a bit like Clarke Gable. This nice little tash, very gypsy looking guy, very nice, very good player. He was just the go-to guy if you wanted a violin on your records, and so they got him. And he thought 10 years later, well, there's all this money sloshing about. Where there's a hit, there's a writ. That's the saying in the music industry. If there's some money being made, you'd like your share. And so he said, well, that bit that everyone's whistling, I wrote that, I should get paid for that, surely. And so the Bluebells, who wrote the song, actually the girl from Bananarama wrote the song and the guy from Bluebells wrote the song. They said, no, you can't have any money. So he went to a lawyer and he sued them. Now, the omens were not good. That's a lot of people have tried that. If you remember Maggie May by Rod Stewart, the mandolin on that's played by a guy who was in a band called Lindisfarne. And he thought he should get even more money. Maggie May's made millions of pounds. He thought he should get some of that money, and he failed. He lost his case and had to pay the legal bill and everything. So the guy from the Bobby Valentino, the fiddle player, decided to go ahead and sue, and so it went to court. No one settled. No one, the judge thought it was worth trying, and so he had to go into the court in London with his violin and show how he'd done this, and he won. He got £100,000 as a payment, and he got 40% of the composer's royalties from there on, which is fantastic. Good on him. Let me just check the time because I'm rattling. Oh, I've got plenty of time. So, to link from the Bluebells, we will link to this uncombed bunch of Herberts. Does anybody recognise these guys? This is Procol Harum. This is taken in 1967. They made a lot of money, but not spent any of it on combs, clearly. So they had a song in 1967 called A Whiter Shade of Pale. Now, the Bluebells song, Young at Heart, would have made a certain amount of money, but there are three. Does anybody know the three songs that are most covered? There's an original version, and then there are thousands, literally thousands, of cover versions of that song. The most covered song is Yesterday by Paul McCartney song, Beatles, obviously. The second, and they've lost count, that's 3,000, at least 3,000. Paul McCartney and John Lennon, or their estate John Lennon, gets paid every time that's played on the radio, or sold, or translated into Greek, and there's versions all around the world. It's very, very lucrative. Number two is a song called Louie Louie. Which is a garage tune from the 1960s that's been covered 2,000 times. But the third is A Whiter Shade of Pale. 1,500 plus cover versions, half of those in a foreign language. I mean, the song is impenetrable in English, let alone in a foreign language. I mean, what was it about? We skipped the light fandango, turned cartwheels across the floor. I was feeling kind of seasick, but the crowd cried out for more. It's nothing, it means nothing. The whole thing is terribly pretentious. But in 1967, I dare say with some smokable assistance, people thought that it was the answer to the world's philosophies. They thought it was number one everywhere in the world, made a lot of money. Now, if I said to you which bit, in fact, all of those cover versions, the one thing they have in common is they all use the intro. So the intro is played on a Hammond organ, and it goes na 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 na. Again, not a singer. Da, na. People will be very familiar with that. And so the guy that played that, his name is Matthew Fisher, who's a Hammond organ player in Procol Harum, and he said, I wrote that bit, I should probably get some of the money then. And they said, no, we wrote it. He wrote the words, Keith, he wrote the words, and Gary sings it, he wrote the piano bit. So no. And so, they sort of fell out, in and out, and he tried several times to get lawyers interested in acting for him, and they all said, no, it's a hopeless case. Eventually, in 2005, he sued them. He got a lawyer that would represent him, and he sued them. And again, he had to prove in court, he had to wheel a Hammond organ. Now, Hammond organ, if anyone knows it's the size of a massive chest of drawers, made out of oak on wheels that you wheel into the court in the Royal Courts of Justice. And he had to play to a judge and show how he had made this part of the tune, how he had come up with the chord sequences and the melody back in 1967. So this was 40 years later. And he won. But because there are so many cover versions, that means millions of pounds of royalties per year for the actual writers, who were Gary Brooker, who was a singer, and a guy called Keith. So they challenged that. They appealed the win, and they won the appeal. And then Matthew Fisher appealed the appeal and won. And Gary Brooker and Keith Reid appealed the appeal to the appeal, and they won on a technicality. And I think the final, I'm not a lawyer, but the final one you get, the fifth, 5 strikes you're out, he appealed again and he won. So Matthew Fish, this guy who I interviewed once, very nice guy, he was working as a computer operator in Croydon, living in a terraced house, and I interviewed him after he'd won, and he said, well, you know, it's probably added £100,000 a year to his annual budget. He was about to retire. I mean, that's probably quite a nice pension, isn't it? Whereas Gary Brooker, who was the singer and the piano player, he had an estate half the size of Surrey. That's where he was talking about serious amounts of money by that they had made. And so now Matthew Fisher gets part of the royalties. He didn't get backdated. He got a lump sum. And he's now credited, and he gets royalties going forward, which is fantastic for him. The irony is, Matthew Fisher, who won, stole the idea. So it's not original. It's actually Bach's Air on a G string with a couple of minor changes, if you listen to it. And so these guys are just Herberts. They're from Southend, actually, originally. They were an R&B group that became a psychedelic group. And so where would a bunch of Herberts from Southend in 1966, 1967, who had not been classically trained, they were just guys from council estates, how would they have heard Bach's Air on a G string? Any ideas? Hamlet. The Hamlet TV commercials that ran for, they might still be running, 60 years later they might still run. That's a particular arrangement of a Bach's Air on a G string by the Jacques Lussier Trio. It's kind of slowed down, and if you go home and listen, but you can get them on YouTube or Spotify or something, identical songs, just slowed up or slowed down. So he won his case, but in the end he did nick it. So, you know, good on him, £100,000 a year. So the last bit of my chain in Edinburgh was Queen, so you saw me doing that on the poster. Now, how do we get from A Whiter Shade of Pale to Queen, and specifically Bohemian Rhapsody? Probably their biggest selling and best-selling song. It's the only song ever to be #1 twice in its original version. It was #1 for 9 weeks in 1975, 1976, and then again when Freddie Mercury died in 1991, 1992. It was #1 again for another 5 weeks or something. So how do we get from White Shade of Pale to Bohemian Rhapsody? Well, luckily I've researched that. So there are 3 songs that I could find whose lyrics include the word fandango. One of them evidently is Whiter Shade of Pale. We skip like fandango and turn cartwheels across the floor. Do the Strand by Roxy Music. Any nods of appreciation for that? Tired of the tango, fed up with fandango? And Bohemian Rhapsody. Scaramouche, Scaramouche. Shall we do the fandango? The Thunderbolt night, very, very light and frightening. In Edinburgh, every day in Edinburgh, someone went, Galileo! Continued it in falsetto, but I'm disappointed that you haven't done that. Sorry, perhaps I'm not in great form. So, yes, Bohemian Rhapsody, one of the most played songs of the last. There's 2 of them, White Shade of Pale and Bohemian Rhapsody, are the most played radio songs since 1952. But it very nearly didn't happen. So they made the record and they wanted to release it as a single, and it's 6 minutes long. It's 5 minutes 55 seconds, I think. And the record company says, "No way, no one's going to play that. Records that long don't get played on the radio." So they went to Capital Radio in London. If anybody used to listen to that, but perhaps they still do. It's still going, of course it is. Kenny Everett was the DJ, and they went to Kenny Everett and they said, "Here's a new song from us, Kenny. You can't play it because it's 6 minutes long. You can have it and take it home, but you can't play it on the radio." "All right," and they winked at him. Really, really obviously, "Kenny, you can't." And he winked back and said, No, I won't play it." And as soon as they left the studio, he played it 20 times back to back. Because that's what Kenny Everett would do, wouldn't he? And so all the Capital Radio listeners are going, well, that's fantastic, this song. We want to. On Monday morning, they all went to the record shop and said, can I have that new song by Queen? It's like very operatic. It starts slow, and then there's a big operatic section in the middle, and then it rocks out at the end. And they said, well, it's not released yet. So the pressure then went back to the record company to release the song. That's how it went out. The problem then, because there's this whole operatic section in the middle, which is 180 separate voices. There's only 3 of Queen could sing. The bass player had a voice like a foghorn, so it was Freddie Mercury, Brian May, and Roger Taylor, who was the drummer. They spent weeks just going la, la, over and over again, and it was all layered. They wore out the tape. It took years. But how do you replicate that? How do you go on top of the Pops and mime to a 180-piece choir? So instead, they made a video for £4,000. It cost that video. Most people probably say it's the first video. It probably isn't, but it's the first one that was used as a marketing tool rather than just. The Beatles used to make videos because they had to be everywhere and they couldn't be everywhere. So they made a film of their new single and they sent it around the world. This was actually promoting the record as such. And so Queen may just have invented pop videos with Bohemian Rhapsody. So that was that's 1975, and I saw them that year on tour. And when they did Bohemian Rhapsody, they all went off stage. They played a tape on live. They just went off for a cup of tea or whatever else pop stars do during intervals in shows. They went off, came back much livelier when they came back. Strange that. And but they never ever, saw them 3 times. They would never ever try and have a choir on there or anything like that. Or they just played the tape and buggered off for 5 minutes and then came back and rocked out, and that's it. So I think I'm probably 25 past. I had 25 minutes, and I think I've been on for 25 minutes. Sorry about the microphone; it pops a lot, and hopefully it's not ruined it too much. But that's it. All right, thank you very much.